Hello everyone. Please make yourself comfortable for tonight's journey. I know that many of you like stories of ghost towns, places that were once thriving and were abandoned for economic reasons or because disaster struck, and they remained as they were. It is a characteristic of towns and cities to constantly evolve when they are populated. New buildings appear, urbanism changes, and they become the sum of the periods they existed through. Ghost towns had this process suddenly interrupted. They stayed frozen in time, and they give us a glimpse of what life was like one or several generations ago. In previous stories, I took you to several of them, like Pripyat in Ukraine, the city near Chernobyl, or Hashima in Japan. You will find links to these stories in the description. But tonight we are going to explore 4 new ghost towns and the stories associated with them. There will be 2 in the United States, Bodie in California and North Brother Island, which has the particularity of being a part of New York City. It belongs to the Bronx, and I will tell you about its most famous resident, Typhoid Mary. Our last 2 visits will be to Latin America. We will go to Mexico and the city of Real de Catorce that can only be accessed through a long tunnel in the mountains, but once had 15,000 souls living from silver mining, and also to Argentina and via Epecuén. It used to be a prosperous thermal spa, a resort, until the town was submerged and evacuated. The waters slowly receded, revealing a ghost town that had stayed sunken for decades. So we have a lot to explore together tonight. This is going to take more than 1 hour. Don't worry if you cannot listen to everything in your first attempt in one sitting. The timestamps are here to help you navigate the story or return later where you left it. You will find the usual links to Spotify or Apple Music with them in the pinned comment under the video, and to my Patreon too, if you wish and can support the channel financially to keep it free of ad breaks, to download audios and videos, or listen to them on your favorite podcast app or directly on Patreon. Your support on Patreon is still very much appreciated and really helps keep me going. Now, take a deep breath. Try to let the tension go in your shoulders, your neck, and your legs. We're going to immediately start our journey in New York City's East River on North Brother Island. There was never an entire town on North Brother Island, but there used to be a hospital, a large institution with several pavilions. Nowadays only its ruins remain, and the island has been designated as a bird sanctuary. Free of human interference, vegetation has covered the island and is slowly swallowing the ruins of the hospital. Its name, Riverside Hospital, remains associated with their most famous patient, who spent over 2 decades there, Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary. And to understand this story that had a big impact on the American public a century ago and became famous worldwide, we need to go back in time to the beginning of the 20th century, when New York City was booming and turning itself a bit more each day into a global metropolis. The first high-rise buildings had appeared. Department stores busted with life. So did train stations, ferries, Broadway, Wall Street. New York City had already outgrown Manhattan, and with wave after wave of immigrants from Europe, former slaves or their descendants who had moved in search of industrial jobs, factories, port facilities. New York City was already a very diverse world, where all social classes were represented, from the poorest to the wealthiest. And our story begins in the most exclusive district of Manhattan, that at the time was already the Upper East Side, in and around Park Avenue. In 1906 and 1907, it appeared that an unusual number of wealthy households were struck by typhoid fever, and this had been going on for years. Typhoid is a bacterial infection that causes high fever, abdominal pain, and headaches, among other symptoms. The majority of people recovered from it, sometimes with symptoms that lasted for months. But typically, typhoid fever was a disease that struck in unsanitary environments, and it was associated with misery and overcrowding, something that seemed totally out of place in the mansions and luxury apartments of Park Avenue. The bacteria responsible for typhoid fever had been identified 20 years earlier, and soon there would be a vaccine and antibiotics that dramatically reduced the incidence of the disease. But in the 1900s, all people could do was to take precautions and treat the symptoms. In the poorest neighborhoods of large cities, typhoid fever outbreaks were still a major cause of mortality. But it was very uncommon in a well-to-do house, let alone several. Investigators looked for a cause of this outbreak, and they soon realized that all families had one thing in common. They had employed the same cook. Her name was Mary Mallon, and she was an immigrant from Ireland. Mary was born in 1869 in what is now Northern Ireland. At the age of 15, like so many Irish people in the 19th century, she emigrated to the United States, where she had family. She lived with her aunt and uncle and worked as a maid, but eventually became a cook for affluent families. In the homes of bankers, industrialists, lawyers, or politicians, the need for help, for maids, cooks, butlers, housekeepers, or drivers was much higher than today, a rich family would typically employ several people. Sometimes there were more of them than family members. Actually, until the First World War, there were huge numbers of domestic employees in Western Europe or in the United States. Employees typically lived with their employers in separate quarters of the house, and the way they were treated depended much on their employers. They were free to go, of course, but the absence of recommendation from their previous employers would make it really difficult to find another job, at least in the same city. So there were all kinds of situations. Some stayed with the same family for their entire lives. Others changed employers if they were discontent, but this often implied moving cities. But not necessarily in a very big city like New York. There were so many opportunities and new wealthy households forming that someone with a sought-after specialty like a cook could change employers relatively easily. And this is what Mary Mallon did several times, from 1900 to 1907. In 7 years, she worked for 8 different families. The times of widespread domesticity are mostly gone nowadays. Of course, there are still very rich households with many employees, but no longer in the upper middle class or even in affluent circles. This practice has diminished a lot. This is due to the combination of different things: rising labor costs, then in the 1930s the Great Depression that impoverished the employers, and even more the changes in lifestyles. People no longer accepted to work and live with their bosses in a situation that didn't give them the possibility to start a family of their own, or just to live freely out of sight of their bosses. All the more that after the Second World War, many more job opportunities in industry and services appeared. On the employer's side, people also no longer wanted, like before, to have that many strangers living under their roof. So from the 1920s, the number of residence employees dropped to the point of becoming almost rare, whereas it was very common 100 years ago. I actually had the two sides of it in my whole family. On the side of my father, my grandmother came from a very popular background, and in the 1930s, aged only 16, she was placed as a maid, a residence maid. At a time when the phenomenon was already declining, but was still happening. She left this position as soon as she could, married my grandfather after the Second World War, and like so many people in the decades after World War II, they could climb the social ladder. They established their own business and ended up living a rather comfortable middle-class life, something that would have been not impossible but exceptional 50 years earlier. On the other side, on my mother's side, the family was more upper class, but its lifestyle changed even more dramatically in the 20th century. My other grandmother was born in a house full of domestic workers. It was a family of 6, and they had more than 10 people to help. A housekeeper, several maids, 2 cooks, a driver. Then came the 1930s, and because of the Depression they had to downsize to only 4 employees. And apparently that was traumatic to my great-grandmother, who now had to talk to them directly instead of having the first housekeeper report to her. Can you imagine that? After the war, the Second World War, my grandmother established her own household, and she had 5 children, but only 3 employees, a cook and 2 maids, which was still respectable in the 1950s. On the next generation, my mother only had help maybe 2 days a week. And now here I am, last generation, making videos in which I clean my things up myself. I'm just kidding, but it reflects how society has changed and how domestic workers are no longer the ubiquitous reality they once were. But let's return to Mary Mallon. She had been trained as a cook, and in 1900 New York City, this was enough to easily find a place. Aged 31, she was hired, and within 2 weeks of her employment, residents developed typhoid fever. In 1901, she moved to another family in Manhattan, and again, several members and employees of the family developed fevers. The laundress even died. She probably observed that these outbreaks had something to do with her presence, because she developed the habit of quitting when typhoid fever erupted and immediately looking for another position in a house where she was unknown. Her next job was with the family of a lawyer. She left again after 7 of the 8 people in that household became ill. In 1904, she was hired by another lawyer. This time the family and their employees resided separately, each group in a different house. Within a week, typhoid fever appeared in the employee's house, and soon 4 of the 7 servants were ill. Immediately after the outbreak, she quitted again, infected yet another house, and took her distance with Manhattan. She found another position in 1906 on Long Island with the family of a wealthy banker. Half the household was soon ill with typhoid fever after they spent time with her in a house they rented for the summer. So she disappeared again and finally found a job in late 1906 in a house on Park Avenue. In early 1907, a maid got sick, and the daughter of the family also developed the disease, leading to her death. This 1907 incident happened when investigators were already searching for Mary. They had her description, an Irish cook who had a pattern of quickly disappearing as soon as typhoid appeared, and had already spread the disease to 6 families of the New York City area. When they knew of a new outbreak at a penthouse on Park Avenue, they rushed there and confronted her. She didn't acknowledge any responsibility and refused to give them the samples to test whether or not she carried the disease, the bacteria. She argued quite simply that she had never been ill with typhoid. At the time, the concept of healthy carrier, someone carrying a disease and able to transmit it without experiencing any symptoms, was unknown, not only to her, to healthcare workers too. So it just didn't make sense to Mary that she could be the source of the infections, even though the way she had escaped multiple times suggests that she had doubts at least. The same year, the investigators had her arrested by New York City Health Department as a public health threat. The arrest was complicated. She had to be restrained and forced to give samples. They revealed massive numbers of typhoid bacteria in her gallbladder, the likely infection center. Under questioning, she revealed that she almost never washed her hands, which is obviously shocking for a cook nowadays. But in the 1900s, the germ theory of disease wasn't fully accepted yet, and it was not uncommon. She was still uncooperative. She refused an operation to remove her gallbladder. That was a risky operation at the time, but doable, and people can live without it, because she didn't believe she could actually carry and transmit the disease. So, against her will, she was sentenced to be quarantined on North Brother Island. We are back to it. At the time in 1907, North Brother Island was only home to a hospital. New York City had already expanded all around the island, but it was too small to be urbanized when there was much more space on the continent or Manhattan. The island had been empty of residents until 1885, when a hospital, Riverside Hospital, moved there. This hospital had been founded in the 19th century to treat and isolate victims of smallpox, and its mission expanded to other diseases that required quarantines, like tuberculosis. The location on an island with no other inhabitants than the patients and the hospital staff was ideal, and so it became a place where the victims of different diseases were isolated in different pavilions. Mary Mallon stayed there for 3 years until 1910, and during this quarantine, she always denied that she carried the disease. She argued that she was healthy and that it was illegal to keep her prisoner with no intentional wrongdoing. She tried to sue the New York Health Department unsuccessfully, and she spent 3 years of anger and desperation on North Brother Island. She had a nervous breakdown. She had to endure different treatments, none of which worked, until 1910. Her incarceration had raised ethical issues, because indeed it was a case where individual freedom was pitched against public health, and given the state of science at this point, the fact that the concept of healthy carrier was just emerging. Actually, Mary Mallon was the first case ever of a healthy carrier recognized in the United States. It was tricky to keep her locked against her will. A compromise was found. She promised to change her occupation and no longer work as a cook, and also to take extra hygienic precautions to protect people that would be in contact with her. And against these promises, she was released from quarantine and she returned to the mainland. But she would be back soon. The return to normal life was hard for her, especially financially. Prior to her incarceration, she was always on the verge of poverty. She didn't have a home, because she stayed with her employers and she had no savings, even though cooking was rather well paid. A young maid typically earned around $20 a month, a cook $50. She initially was given a job as a laundress, but on top of being frustrated at her financial situation, she wounded her arm and couldn't work for 6 months. She had several unsuccessful years until she decided to cook again. The problem was that she had become a little celebrity during her years of incarceration. The nickname Typhoid Mary had been coined by doctors and spread in the press because it was catchy and the story was very unusual. People did not really know what she looked like, but many had heard of her story and had read her name. So she used fake surnames and took jobs as a cook against the instructions of health authorities. She could not do it for upscale families anymore because agencies or employers would do background checks. So she moved to the mass sector, restaurants, hotels, spa centers. And obviously, denial doesn't kill bacteria, so the same outbreaks of typhoid reappeared in her wake. Everywhere she worked, but on a larger scale this time, people fell ill. She came back to her old habit of quitting and disappearing. Investigators looked for her and hunted her down to a hospital where she had recently started working and already infected 25 people. She was arrested and taken back to North Brother Island in 1915, and this time it would be forever. She stayed quarantined on the island for 23 more years, until her death in 1938. It must have been a lonely and boring life on this small island that she was not authorized to live. This time, the kind of ethical questions raised by her first incarceration no longer interested anyone. She had disregarded her promises and infected at least 53 people, 3 of whom died. But this may just be the tip of the iceberg, because her itinerary before 1900 and between 1910 and 1915 could never be retraced very precisely. She probably infected many more, maybe up to hundreds of people, especially between her 2 quarantines. For more than 20 years, people kept their distance with her. In reality, typhoid bacteria is not airborne and has to be ingested, so it was not that dangerous to be around her. But according to the few testimonies of people who met her during this long quarantine, she stuck to her habits of not washing her hands and denying she was responsible for anything. Her story gained even more fame, to the point that most people have heard of Typhoid Mary, sometimes without exactly knowing what it refers to. She finally died of pneumonia at age 69 in 1938, and her body was cremated. North Brother Island had lost its most famous resident, and shortly after the hospital closed. Many of the infectious diseases it specialized on had found treatments or vaccines. For example, smallpox, which was the initial infection the Riverside Hospital had been created for, was already declining in the 20th century, and it ended being eradicated worldwide in the 1970s. So the hospital closed, and after World War II, North Brother Island served as a temporary home for veterans and their families because of an acute housing shortage in the region of New York City. In the 1950s, it became a facility to treat and rehabilitate adolescent drug addicts away from the temptations and dangers of the city. Many patients claimed that they were actually held against their will, and after a corruption scandal, the facility closed for good in 1963. North Brother Island was ready to turn into a ghost place. It was no longer inhabited, theoretically attractive, located in the heart of a metropolis like New York City, where space is valuable, but not large enough to receive the massive investment necessary to fully urbanize it. There were projects since the 1960s, like turning it into a housing project for the homeless, or using it to expand the jail at Rikers Island, which is closed. But none of them saw the light of day. The original hospital's buildings are still there and still stand, but they are being swallowed by the forest. The vegetation has invaded the courtyards, climbed along the walls, entered the corridors and all patient rooms. If nothing is done, the old buildings will eventually collapse and disappear under a green blanket. The place has not been lost for everyone. Wildlife has returned to it, especially birds. And if the ghost of Typhoid Mary haunts the remains of the hospital, birds are her only companions. For our second story, we are going to stay in America, but change coast. We are now heading to California, and an atmospheric remain of California's gold mining past. Welcome to Bodie, population 0. In the 1850s, California was experiencing a sudden boom, the gold rush, that followed the discovery of rich and easy-to-collect gold deposits. The rush itself lasted a few years, until about 1855, and then it receded. But the search for gold and the opening of mines went on. A majority of ghost towns in America are remains of the sudden local booms and busts of the 19th century, be it because of mines or the construction of railroads. New villages popped up constantly from the Midwest to the Pacific coast along the 19th century. A few of them turned into towns, then gained critical mass and diversified their activity. But many more were abandoned after a short boom, leaving only a few buildings as traces. Sometimes, though, they had grown fast and long enough to gain infrastructure and thousands of inhabitants. Bodie is in this category. In the 1850s and 60s, there were many independent prospectors searching for gold, alone or in small groups. Such a group with one member called Bodie discovered gold in 1859 near what would become the town of Bodie, but the man who gave it his name never saw it because he died the following year in a blizzard. Bodie was in the mountains near the limit with Nevada, at an elevation of more than 8,000 feet. Not an extremely hostile environment, but it could get really cold in the winter at this altitude. And despite the discovery, Bodie didn't attract much interest at first. There were other competing sites, and the find was not extraordinary. So, on the site only a few miners lived in what looked more like a camp than a town. By 1868, 9 years after the discovery, only 2 small companies had built stamp mills, which are a type of machines that crush material to extract ore. But both had failed to collect significant quantities of gold, and it seems that the days of the camp were numbered. All the more that close to it, in Nevada, silver mines with much higher yields had been opened. Until 1876, the real takeoff of Bodie. A profitable deposit of gold-bearing ore was discovered, and suddenly turned the camp into a hotspot of gold prospection. Prospectors and employees of mining companies began to rush to the site, looking for more, and they found more. In 1878, 2 years later, more discoveries around the first mine had happened, and Bodie turned into a boom town. By 1879, it had 7,000 to 10,000 inhabitants already, and 2,000 buildings, in a location that barely had any 4 years earlier. The boom continued in 1880. The prospect of fast fortune attracted ever more prospectors, and with this population, a lot of new amenities popped up. Bodie had a Wells Fargo bank, for example. The name Wells Fargo was for a long time associated with the California boom. Wells Fargo is now the name of a big financial services company. It has purchased or merged with other banks, but the name Wells Fargo has its origins in California, and especially at the time of the California gold rush. Its 2 founders, Wells and Fargo, were in the express business in the east of the United States, that is to say, fast mail delivery, which in the 1840s was a young and very competitive industry. Together with mail distribution, they were looking to expand their range of services, and Wells and Fargo contributed to the creation of another well-known brand name that later became a credit card company, American Express. They wanted to expand to California, but the board of American Express didn't let them. So they decided to create their own company, Wells Fargo, in San Francisco. It was an express business, but it also provided other services and doubled as a financial institution. In 1855, the California gold rush reversed, and there was a financial collapse, with people running to the banks to get back their deposits, in fear that all banks would go bust. And indeed, the majority did. But Wells Fargo was one of the few that survived and could reopen, which turned out to be immensely profitable because it acquired a reputation for soundness and reliability. It kept expanding in the 1850s and 60s. It was already an express company that doubled as a bank, and it turned into a sort of all-purpose business, doing communications, acting as transportation agent. It launched stagecoach lines. So in these years, 1860s, 1870s, the presence of Wells Fargo in a new Californian town was the guarantee of communication lines, of funding, of seriousness for any new town that hoped to keep attracting migrants and grow even more. For Bodie, it was a promising sign of a bright future. The town also had its first newspaper, followed by several more, various firefighter companies. It became connected to railroad, it had a station, and along Main Street, the number of saloons peaked at 65. It had also a small Chinatown with several hundred Chinese residents at one point, also a red light district, a cemetery. It didn't go without problems. Main Street was a dangerous place with brawls and shootings happening regularly around the saloons. There were stagecoach hold-ups, opium dens multiplied in Chinatown. All of these elements that make the folklore of the West were present, but for the inhabitants of Bodie in the 1870s and 1880s, they were also a daily reality, and it probably felt much less romantic and picturesque than in Western movies. It was also a dangerous and harsh type of life. After 4 years of explosive growth, the first signs of decline appeared by the end of the year 1880. Gold production around Bodie was significant. It peaked above $3 million annually. Adjusted for inflation, you can multiply that by about 25 to get present-day dollars. So that would make $75 million, or 7,500 by inhabitant. That was a very high income per capita for the 19th century. It is always hard to recreate past levels of income, and the figures should be taken cautiously, but for comparison, the US GDP per capita around 1880 is estimated around $5,000. To compare it with the wealth of Bodie, we would have to take into account all the goods and services produced in the town and add them to its mining production. If we do that, the wealth per inhabitant can be cautiously estimated to at least twice the national average, which is impressive for a town that didn't even exist a few years earlier. But it didn't last, because a large part of the population were prospectors attracted by the boom, and many arrived after the last discoveries of deposits. Their prospection didn't give results, or not enough, and in those years there were constantly new spots in the news. In 1880 they included Tombstone, Arizona, or sites in Utah and Montana. So the miners, hoping to get rich quickly, did not hesitate to move. And they started abandoning Bodie for more promising locations. As the population stabilized, Bodie became more family-oriented. These boom towns initially tended to have several men for one woman. The demographics were very unbalanced. With the departure of miners, essentially male, and children born in the town, the face of Bodie changed. It certainly became safer, churches were built, and despite the decline in population, the town found a new balance that lasted through the 1880s and 1890s. The mines were still producing. In the 1890s, they were helped by technical advancements, like the cyanide process that allowed to recover gold from low-grade ore bodies. But the population was still declining. It passed the 5,000 bar, then 1,000. The saloons all closed, so did the bank, and by 1910 there were only 700 people left, essentially families who didn't want to move to more prosperous places. They now occupied a town too big for them, where the price of properties was quickly reaching zero because of the lack of demand. The last newspaper was printed in 1912. By 1914 and 15, the gold production had become almost neglectable. Mines had shut down, and railroad tracks started to be scrapped for iron. By 1920, the population was 120, and even though it was technically not a ghost town yet, it already looked like one. Bodie continued to slowly agonize until the 1940s, when the population reached zero. A family that owned much of the land hired caretakers to protect the structures from vandalism and maintain them, which probably saved Bodie from losing the remains of its past glory. The town was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1961 and turned into a park that has been preserved in a state of arrested decay. That is to say, the buildings are not repaired to their original state, they are frozen in time as they were 70 to 100 years ago when the town was abandoned. This type of park combines two different ways of looking at the same town. There is a historical one, because the buildings are remains from the late 19th century and the times of the Wild West. But at the same time, the eerie atmosphere and the nostalgia of an empty town are preserved by making it look abandoned. The signs of decay are preserved. This approach to preservation is very characteristic of our times. We like to see old buildings and imagine what life was like, but we also like their ruins because they are emotional, they evoke the passing of time, and they tell us a story. We don't want to see patrimonial buildings repaired to the point of looking brand new. Signs of aging are necessary for them to keep their evocative power. There are many ghost towns in America that date back from the same period, but Bodie is certainly one of the best preserved and accessible, even though only 170 buildings are maintained. This is less than 10% of what the town actually had at its peak, so it doesn't really do justice to its past size. But the atmosphere, the urbanism, the preservation work, all this makes it a great place to visit. And now, let's move again for our third visit. This one is spectacular. We are about to explore Real de Catorce. We are now on the Mexican plateau, an arid expanse bordered by mountains that occupies much of northern Mexico. The plateau is irregular. There are elevations and depressions, and it is in one of the highest regions that our destination is hidden. Hidden because to access the town, there is only one way, a 1.5-mile tunnel dug in a mountain. The tunnel is not wide enough for vehicles to cross it both ways, so travelers in and out have to wait their turn. At the other end of the tunnel appears a large town in a valley between peaks 9,000 feet above sea level. There were once 15,000 residents here by the end of the 19th century. The town lived from some of Mexico's richest silver mines. At the time it had prosperous mansions, busy streets, bordered with dozens of shops, some of them selling European luxury goods. It had a bull ring, churches, everything you can expect to find in a 19th century city of a respectable size. The story of Real de Catorce resembles that of other mining towns, a spectacular boom, followed by a bust. But there is more here than atmospheric scenery. The city was never entirely abandoned, because it is a place for pilgrims. Christian pilgrims go visit the reputedly miraculous image of Saint Francis. And the place is also sacred to Huichol indigenous people. They visit the area, the valley, every spring to leave offerings at the ceremonial center. And during this time, they also visit the desert below Real de Catorce to gather a supply of peyote, the magical cactus that they use to guide their path and consciousness. The Huichol populated the mountains west of the Mexican plateau long before Real de Catorce entered its years of prosperity. To them, this valley is the eastern limit of their sacred territory, which is why it became a place of pilgrimage. There had been a village or a hamlet in this valley for many years when silver was discovered in the mountains nearby in 1772. Mexico was still part of the Spanish Empire at the time. The Spanish name Real de Catorce means Royal 14, because 14 soldiers died here, killed by indigenous warriors. And this name was given to the settlement, which was very remote and still is. The closest large city is San Luis Potosí, but it is 160 miles to the south. Between the isolation and the aridity, there was not much in favor of development for Real de Catorce until the discovery of silver deposits. By 1779, the hamlet had become a village, and in the following decades it turned into a town. Growth was not as spectacular as in Bodie, but it lasted much longer. The town expanded all along the 19th century, populated by locals, miners in search of a job, prospectors. A mint was built. Administrators arrived to control this new resource, and along the 19th century, the town benefited from a rise in the price of silver. The peak of 15,000 people was reached by the end of the 19th century. But in 1900, there was a crash in the price of silver, and this collapse, combined with the depletion of deposits, suddenly impoverished the town. The population emigrated by the thousands, and soon Real de Catorce was left with a few hundred residents in a town 10 times too large for them. The regular visit of pilgrims is what saved it from becoming a complete ghost town, even though it could never compensate for the 1900 collapse. And nowadays, Real de Catorce only has about 1,000 permanent residents. The town has kept the picturesque aspect of 19th century Mexican towns, and it served as a set in several movies. I told you that one of the reasons why Huichol pilgrims come to the Real de Catorce Valley is to collect peyote. This plant grows low to the ground. It is a type of cactus, but it is mostly known for its history of ritualistic and medicinal use by various groups of native North Americans. The plant is native to Mexico and the southwest of Texas. It contains a hallucinogen called mescaline. In the context of rituals, it helps induce visions. Its use was widespread in the Aztec Empire when the Spanish arrived in Mexico, but it started long before that, maybe about 6,000 years ago, and other peoples than the Huichol used it. Actually, the same hallucinogen also occurs in other types of cactus that grow in North and South America. These were used in Peru or Ecuador. Once the colonization of Mexico began, the church and the authorities repressed its use on religious grounds, on the basis that it was pagan and also a drug. This, combined with the drop in native populations, made the use of peyote almost disappear. It was confined to a few areas of Mexico, along the Pacific coast and the southwest of Texas. By the end of the 19th century, though, a revival began in various Native American people. They were rediscovering their cultural roots or reappropriating them. At the same time, religious persecutions had ended or at least strongly receded, and peyote was reappropriated. It is only legal for Huichol people in Mexico to have peyote, because it is part of their religion. But given its hallucinogen properties, it is forbidden to all other groups. It doesn't mean this is always harshly enforced and respected, a bit like for ayahuasca in Peru, which is another psychoactive preparation, a brew made with certain vines. There is a small touristic activity around peyote. It is now time for us to leave Real de Catorce and the Mexican plateau for our fourth and last visit of the night. This time we are going to Argentina for a village with a very different type of story. Argentina has gained a reputation for political and economic instability in the 20th century. The country has defaulted multiple times on its debt. It struggles with inflation and poverty, and it seems unable to escape an economic roller coaster of booms and busts. But it was not always like that. This deterioration started in the 1930s. Prior to that, in the early 20th century, Argentina was a model country for economic growth and general prosperity that had outgrown many European countries, including its former colonial masters in Spain. Argentina benefits from large expanses of flat and fertile land that give it a strong advantage when it comes to agriculture. In the late 19th century, an inflow of foreign capital and immigration helped develop the country to the point that it became a genuinely wealthy economy for the time. By 1905, its GDP per capita was similar to Germany, France, or Canada. Average wages were 96% of that of Britain, so basically almost similar. Argentina was as prosperous as a country could be back then, even though its economy was rather unbalanced, since it relied heavily on agricultural exports rather than industrial goods, and it was also massively unequal, but not more than Western Europe or the United States at the time. This prosperity attracted migrants from Europe, especially from Italy. About a third of today's Argentinian population is of Italian descent. For European migrants at the time, Buenos Aires, the capital, could be an alternative to New York City as the door to a new world. And its past prosperity at the turn of the 20th century is still visible in its urbanism and architecture. It used to be called the Paris of the Southern Hemisphere. Many foreign architects, especially French, were contracted to replicate the kind of housing and public buildings that corresponded to the taste of the time. Argentina reached its economic peak, at least relatively to other economies, just before the First World War. The war had repercussions all around the world, including in regions that didn't see any fighting. For Latin American countries, it was a drop in investment from European countries. They depended a lot on foreign capital, especially British. But European belligerents immediately cut their investments and repatriated capital. The reversal of capital flows threw all of Latin America into an economic crisis, and European capital never returned to the same extent after the war, because European powers had all been financially ruined and turned into debtors instead of being the bankers of the world. But still, Argentina resisted this crisis better than its neighbors, and the 1920s were still a time of relative prosperity with the return of global trade. The real inflection point would be in the following decade, with the depression of the 1930s, and the 1920s are when our story begins, in a rich economy that followed the trends of Western Europe and North America, that is to say, an expansion of consumption and leisure. In the province of Buenos Aires, there is a lake, Lake Epecuén, which has a particularity. Its waters are very salty, as much as the Dead Sea. In the early 1920s, this characteristic, plus the mild climate and the proximity of various railroad lines, gave entrepreneurs the idea of building a spa town on the shore of the lake. They would advertise the properties of the water and sell the place as an ideal spot for vacation and cures. The creation of resorts like this is as old as the massification of tourism. At the same time, similar seaside or lakeside resorts were created in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Britain, in the United States. This type of vacation in the 1920s was essentially for upper-class people, but the potential public was growing fast, and it never stopped along the 20th century as more and more people got the means and the free time to become clients. A village with the first spa was founded and called Villa Epecuén. The project didn't disappoint, and the village grew with hotels, restaurants, a train station, light industries exploiting salt from the lake, high-end residencies and second homes for wealthy inhabitants of Buenos Aires. By the 1930s, Villa Epecuén had all the infrastructure of a permanent little town, and it kept growing until the early 1980s. At this point, it had a permanent population of only 1,200 people, but its population peaked at 25,000 in the summer, and there were 6,000 hotel rooms. The only trouble was that the waters of the lake could fluctuate quite a lot each year, depending on precipitations, and several areas of the province were threatened by floods, because there were various lakes with different levels, but the variations in the waters of Lake Epecuén had been anticipated. There was a long embankment, 4 meters high, that's about 12 feet, that protected the town. But in the early 1980s, several consecutive years of strong rains made the lake rise regularly by 2 feet per year. This had already happened before, and typically drier years followed and leveled the lake. Except this time, they didn't. In 1985, the rain was more abundant than ever, and floods happened in various parts of the province of Buenos Aires. In November 1985, the ongoing rise of the lake and wind generating waves broke the dike. Millions of gallons of excess salty water flooded Villa Epecuén, and the flood lasted 4 days, with the water rising inexorably. The flood was slow enough for all inhabitants to be evacuated, and there was no fatality, even though 1,500 residents lost everything. Everything because instead of receding, the water kept rising for 2 more years. When it reached its peak in 1987, all buildings had disappeared, swallowed by the lake. In 1993, the town was 7 meters underwater, but in the 1990s, the water level stabilized and started to slowly go down. In the years 2000, some buildings began to reappear, and by 2010, almost the entire town with its streets, houses, and hotels was visible again. But the landscape after 20 years under salty water had changed dramatically. Houses and dead trees were coated with white salt. Along streets now totally silent. Here and there are rusted vehicles, and the last bonds keep drying up among the ruins. The only visitors now are photographers, a few journalists and tourists, curious to see by themselves the unique landscape left by the spillage of the lake. We have reached the end of our stories for tonight. There are still many more ghost towns with their respective stories we could explore, so let me know if you would like another compilation of the same kind. But for now, you can let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library. A heartfelt thank you to all of you who support the channel with your comments and signs of appreciation, or even financially. This is very much appreciated. Good night for now. Sweet dreams, and I'll talk to you soon with another adventure. Au revoir.